Welcome. You don't have to do anything right now. Whatever the day has asked of you, whatever it still holds in reserve for tomorrow, none of that matters in this moment. You can set it all down. You can let your body grow a little heavier, a little warmer, a little more settled into whatever you happen to be lying. We're going to spend some time together in a place that no longer exists, not in the way it once did anyway. A small fishing village on the coast of England, or perhaps the coast of northern France, or the low shores of the Baltic, depending on how the light falls in your imagination. It doesn't matter precisely where. What matters is the texture of it, the smell of salt and wood smoke, the particular gray green of the sea before sunrise, the sound which you will not hear, but which you can feel in the architecture of this moment, of nets being gathered, of rope being pulled through weathered hands, of wooden boats settling against a stone pier. The time is somewhere around the year 1320s or 1280 or 1340. Again, the precision doesn't matter much. The world we are visiting moved slowly. One generation handed its routines to the next with very little ceremony. What your grandfather knew about the tides, you knew. What your grandmother knew about the curing of fish, your mother knew too, and so do you. History at this scale is not a succession of events. It is a texture, a pattern of days repeated with minor variation across decades and centuries. That is what we're going to explore tonight. Not battles, not kings, not dates you need to remember. Just a single ordinary day in a place where life was slow, wet, cold, and in its own unremarkable way, complete. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let your breathing slow just a little. We're going to begin before dawn. The village does not have a name that anyone outside of it would know. In the historical record, if it appears at all, it might be listed in a text document as a cluster of perhaps 40 or 50 households, a reeve, a kind of local administrator would have recorded it as a place that owed a certain number of salted fish per year to the lord of the nearby manor. That is the extent of its fame. A line in an account book written in Latin by a clerk who never visited, in a record that survived only because it ended up stored in a monastery archive that was itself eventually absorbed into a cathedral library, where it sat unread for 600 years. But the village existed, and on this particular morning, a morning in late September, when the fishing was still good, but the days were growing noticeably shorter, it existed with considerable specificity. The first thing you would notice if you were somehow present is the darkness. Not the darkness of a power outage in a modern city, which is never quite complete because there are always distant streetlights and glow of neighboring buildings. This is a different kind of dark. The darkness before artificial light, before gas lamps and electric bulbs, before anything that burned continuously through the night, except candles and hearth fires. And those were carefully managed, carefully preserved, because fire was expensive and difficult and not to be wasted. The village at the fourth hour before dawn is almost entirely silent. The sea is present as a sound at the edge of awareness, a low, constant conversation between water and stone, but nothing in the village itself is moving. The fishing boats are pulled up on a shallow beach of grey pebbles, or moored to a short wooden pier whose posts are wrapped in barnacles and green weed to the height of the high tide mark. The nets are folded or hung to dry on wooden frames, low structures built parallel to the shore, slung with rope and twine in great drooping loops that, if you looked at them in daylight, would remind you a little of the rigging of a ship that has somehow been laid flat. The houses are low. Almost all of them are built of the materials immediately available: stone where stone was plentiful, timber framed and wattle and daub where it was not. In a coastal village, you frequently find both, mixed together without any particular plan, added to over generations as families grew and then shrank again. A house might have an original stone core, one room, perhaps 12 feet by 15, with a single door and one or two very small windows, with a later addition to of a lean to timber structure on one side, a storage shed of bundled reeds and rough hewn planks on the other. The roof lines are not even. They dip and rise and meet at odd angles. Thatch is the most common roofing material, though coastal villages sometimes use flat stones weighed down against wind in areas where suitable stone could be split thin. Inside these houses, people are sleeping, and the way they sleep is worth a moment of attention. There is, in most homes, a central hearth, not a fireplace with a chimney. Chimneys are still relatively uncommon in peasant dwellings at this period, and where they do exist, they are sometimes crude, sometimes elaborate, depending on the wealth and ambition of the builder. More often, there is simply a fire pit or a raised hearth of stone or clay positioned in the middle or off to one side of the main room. The smoke rises and finds its way out through a hole in the roof, or through the gaps in the thatch, or through a small loaf vent, imperfectly. The houses of this period, if you were to enter one, would smell strongly of smoke, not dangerously. The inhabitants were adapted to it, and the construction, while imperfect, was not airtight, but noticeably, permanently. The smoke smell lived in the walls, in the stored food, in the clothing and the hair of the people themselves. The fire is banked for the night. Someone, usually the last person to go to sleep, often the woman of the household, has arranged the embers carefully, covered them with ash to hold the heat, so that in the morning there would still be a live coal to restart the fire without the labor of striking a new one from flint and steel. This is important. Fire starting is not difficult exactly, but it takes time and effort, and there is never enough time and effort to spare. A live coal carried over from the previous night is a small act of continuity, a warmth handed from one day to the next. People sleep on the pallets of straw or bracken, sometimes covered with rough wool blankets, sometimes with sheepskin. In wealthier households and in a fishing village, wealth is relative, but there are gradations. There might be a proper wooden bedstead raised off the floor. Most people sleep on or very close to the ground. Children are tucked in together, bodies generating heat collectively. Older relatives, grandparents, aunts may sleep closest to the banked fire because the cold is harder on them and because they are less able to generate warmth from their own bodies. The animals, if the family keeps any, a goat perhaps, a few chickens, a pig in a good year, may sleep in an adjacent pen, or in some households in the same room, separated only by a low wooden partition. This is not considered unusual. The animals produce heat. The heat is useful. The smell is accepted. Outside, the September night has a particular quality. The air coming off the sea is not freezing. That comes later in the true cold months, but it has weight to it, dampness, salt. When you breathe it in, you feel it coat the inside of your nose and throat with something mineral and clean. The sky, if you were to look up, would be enormous. No light pollution means stars in densities that most people alive today have never seen. The Milky Way is a physical feature of the night sky, as solid looking as a cloud bank, arching from one horizon to the other. But no one is looking at the stars right now. The village is asleep. Even the dogs, and there would be dogs, working dogs, not pets exactly, thin bodied, mixed breed animals who earn their place by alerting the household to strangers and vermin. Even the dogs are quiet, curled in doorways or under the eaves of outbuildings, heads tucked into their own flanks for warmth. The sea continues its low conversation with the shore, and this is how the morning begins. The person who wakes first is usually not roused by a sound. There are no alarm devices. There are no clocks of any kind in this village. Clocks exist in this period, but they are rare, expensive, and found in monasteries and wealthy households in towns. Over out here, time is measured by the body, by the light, by the tides. What wakes the fisherman? And on this particular morning, let's follow a fisherman, a man perhaps 35 years, which is to say middle age by the standards of this time and place, is an internal sense of rightness. His body knows roughly what time it is. It knows because it has woken at this hour, more or less, for the entirety of his adult life. Habit is a physical thing. It lives in the muscles and the slow rhythms of the blood. He lies still for a moment. His wife is asleep beside him, warm bodied, turned away. Two of his children, there were four, but two did not survive infancy, which was not unusual, are visible in the dimness on the other side of the room, humped shapes beneath a wool blanket. He can hear the sea, which tells him nothing he does not already know about the weather, because the sea sounds the same regardless of what the sky is doing, until the wind picks up beyond a certain point. And this morning, the sound is steady and low, which is reassuring. He sits up, rolls his neck, his back aches, as it always aches now, a dull conversation between his spine and the years of hauling nets and rowing and carrying baskets of fish. He pulls on his clothing. He has slept partly dressed because the cold, and he moves to the hearth. The coals are still alive. Good. He kneels and blows gently, and the ash stirs and the coals glow orange, and he feeds the fire small pieces of wood, then larger ones, building it back up with the patience of someone who has done this thousands of times. There is a particular sequence to it, tinder, then kindling, then the heavier fuel, and he follows the sequence without thinking about it, the way a musician plays scales with a part of the mind that has learned the pattern so thoroughly that the conscious attention can be elsewhere. Where is his attention? Difficult to say. Perhaps on the weather, reviewing what he noticed yesterday afternoon, the color of the sky at sunset, the behavior of the birds, the particular way of the wind has shifted, and comparing it to what he knows, a store of accumulated observation that constitute his meteorological knowledge. Perhaps on his nets, which need a section repaired, a length of cord that frayed last week, and which he has been meaning to fix, perhaps on nothing at all, which is not emptiness but something like the general attending to the present moment that people in pre literate, pre scheduled cultures seem to have done more naturally than we do. The fire catches, light fills the room, not bright, not even, but warm and mobile, the light of flame, which moves and flickers and makes the walls seem to breathe. His wife wakes a few minutes later. There's no discussion about who does what next. These routines have settled into unconscious agreement over years of marriage. She moves to the clay pot hanging over the rebuilt fire. Last night's pottage, a thick stew of whatever was available, probably oats or barley thickened with some dried fish and a few root vegetables, onions certainly, maybe turnip, and begins heating it. This will be the first meal of the day, taken quickly, standing or sitting on the edge of the pallet before the serious work begins. The children will not wake for a while. Children in this period had somewhat different rhythms. They were useful in various ways, gathering fuel, tending animals, helping with lighter household tasks, but they were not expected to join the pre dawn fishing work. That would come later, when the boys were old enough to be genuinely helpful in the boat. Our fisherman eats. The pottage is hot and thick and tastes of salt and fish and the particular earthiness of barley. He drinks water from a wooden bucket filled yesterday from the village well, and perhaps a small cup of weak ale, because water is not always trustworthy, and ale, even at low strength, provides both nourishment and a degree of safety against waterborne illness. The ale here would be nothing like modern beer. It is flat, slightly sour, grain heavy, nourishing in the way that bread is nourishing. He puts on his outer garment, a coarse woolen tunic that comes to mid thigh, belted, worn over another tunic, worn over a linen undershirt that is the most expensive item of clothing he owns and which is laundered carefully, infrequently. On his feet, wrappings of cloth and then leather shoes, crude by modern standards but adequate. They keep the worst of the cold and wet out, more or less, though they will be wet through by mid morning. Over everything, a cloak of oiled wool, heavy, dark, smelling of lanolin and fish and salt air and smoke. In rough weather, he would add a hood. This morning is not rough, only cold. He goes out into the dark. The walk from his house to the waterfront takes perhaps 3 minutes. The village is small. The paths between the houses are not paved. There's no paving in this village, not even flat stones, and they are muddy from recent rain, with channels worn by years of foot traffic and the occasional passing of a cart. He knows every root and rock and hollow of this path without needing to see it. He has walked it so often that his feet would carry him safely in complete darkness, which tonight they essentially are. Other fishermen are appearing. You will not see them easily. They are shapes in the dark, moving with the particular deliberate quiet of people who are awake while others sleep, and who has internalized the etiquette of not disturbing them. A word or two passes. There's a particular kind of morning communication among working people that is almost a dialect unto itself, compressed, functional, more about confirming shared knowledge than exchanging information. A look at the sky, a comment about the wind, a response, an acknowledgement, then to work. The boats are pulled up on the shingle beach, and each man goes to his own with the familiarity of someone going to a tool that is an extension of himself. These are not large boats. A typical inshore fishing vessel of this period might be 15 to 20 feet long, clinker built, and is, with planks overlapping one another like the scales of a fish, rather than laid edge to edge, with broad beam relative to its length. It is designed for stability in choppy inshore water, for the ability to be beached and launched through surf by a small crew, and for carrying a useful load of fish. It is not designed for comfort or speed. The construction of such a boat is worth a moment. The wood would be oak, ideally, though other timbers were used when oak was not available. The planks were shaped by skilled craftsmen. Boat builders occupied a specific and valued niche in coastal communities and fastened with iron rivets, each driven through and then clinched over the on the inside. The caulking between planks was done with tarred rope or moss, or sometimes a combination, and the entire hull was periodically retarred to maintain its waterproofing. A well maintained boat of this type could last 20 or 30 years. A poorly maintained one might rot through in 5. Our fisherman checks his boat with hands as much as eyes. He runs his palms along the strakes, the rows of planking, feeling for softness that might indicate rot, for loose rivets, for anything that wasn't right last evening. Everything seems sound. He checks the oarlocks, simple tall pins, not metal oarlocks, just wooden pegs against which the oars are rested and pulled. He checks the bailing scoop, a piece of wood shaped like a crude ladle, because all wooden boats leak always, and bailing is a constant minor task of any voyage. His companion arrives. In this village, the boats go out in pairs or small crews. Our fisherman and his brother in law, a younger man of perhaps 28, quieter, less experienced but competent, they work without much talk to load the boat, the nets, which have been folded and stacked the previous evening, are heavy and resistant to easy handling. The net for inshore fishing in this period might be a trammel net, a combination of fine inner mesh and coarser outer mesh that traps fish, or simple drag net, depending on what they're targeting. This morning, They are after herring, which are running this time of year in large shoals. And for herring, they use a drift net, a long curtain of fine mesh that hangs in the water like a wall, supported by floats of cork or dried bladder on the top edge, and the weights of lead or stone on the bottom, so that it hangs vertically and the fish swim to it and are caught by their gills. The net is coiled and stacked in the bow. The oars are placed. A small wooden bailing bucket is wedged under the stern seat. Length of spare rope, a knife at the belt, always a knife, for cutting line in an emergency, a bag with bread and hard cheese for the hours of the water. They push the boat off the shingle. The sound of the hull on the pebbles is a grinding scrape, then a sudden lightness as the bow lifts on the water. They scramble aboard. One holds the gunwale while the other pushes off, then vaults in and settle to the oars, pulling away from the shore into the dark water. The village behind them is a low dark shape against a sky just beginning to show the gray distinction between cloud and nothing. A few lights, hearth glow through doorways, a tallow dip candle in someone's window. The dogs have stirred. A rooster, prematurely inspired, announces a dawn that is still some time away. The fishermen row. Rowing a clinker boat in the dark in September on the inshore waters of northern Europe is a special physical experience that is difficult to fully imagine from the outside. Your hands are immediately cold. The oar handles are smooth from use but cold, and the motion of rowing, a pull back and up, a feather of the blade, a forward reach, a drop, is warming to the shoulders and arms, but the hands remain cold throughout because the wet rope and the wet wood never warm to skin temperature, not in September. You notice it after a while, or rather, the noticing recedes to a background awareness that lives alongside the work rather than interrupting it. The water at this hour has a particular character. The sea surface is not rough this morning. The wind is light from the northwest, which is unusual for this time of year, but it is not flat either. There's always some movement, some memory of yesterday's wind or last night's distant storm, some rhythm of long, slow swells that lifts and settles the boat in a slow cadence. The motion is not unpleasant. After a lifetime on the water, it is simply the world's natural movement. The land, by contrast, seems strangely fixed when you think about it. They row for perhaps half an hour, moving out from the shore and along the coast to a stretch of water they know by accumulated experience and received wisdom. The knowledge of where herring tends to run at this time of year, encoded in observation and in what fathers have told sons for generations. There's no chart, there's no depth sounder. There is their own knowledge, their reading of the color of the water, the presence of certain birds, the direction of the current, the character of the bottom as felt through a weighted line. They know these waters the way you know a room you have lived in for years, not consciously, not as explicit information, but as a kind of bodily familiarity. When they reach their spot, And it is not a precise spot, but a general region where conditions feel right this morning. They ship the oars and begin to pay out the drift net. This is careful work. The net must go over the side smoothly without tangling, without the floats fouling the weights or the weight fouling the mesh. They work in the dark by feel, each man taking his section of net and feeding it into the water, and the net unfolds and sinks into a hanging curtain, its float line bobbing gently at the surface, its depth governed by the weight of the lead sinkers. When the net is fully set, they make the end of it fast on the bow's boat and then let the boat drift. That is the nature of drift netting. You are attached to the net, and the net drifts with the current and the wind. And the idea is that the herring, swimming in their enormous shoals, will encounter the net in the darkness and swim into it. Now comes the waiting. The two men sit in the drifting boat. They can talk, and sometimes do, quietly, not because anyone can hear them, but because the dark and the water and the early hour have a quality that discourages loudness, or they can be quiet, which is also acceptable. They eat a little of the bread and cheese. They watch the sky, where the gray distinction in the east is now perceptibly lighter, working its way up from the horizon toward the zenith, replacing the darkest dark with a pewter colored pre dawn that has no warmth in it but is unmistakably light beginning. The stars fade, first the faintest ones, then the middling ones, until only the brightest remain, and then they too dissolve into the brightening sky. Jupiter perhaps is the last to go, or Venus, if Venus is a morning star this season. The birds begin, a few at first, a gannet very high, making its way somewhere with the particular effortless efficiency of large seabirds, banking and gliding on invisible architecture of air. Then a group of kittiwakes, low over the water, calling. The call of kittiwakes are, in a certain light, almost human. There is a quality of complaint or announcement in them, a sociability, a constant commentary on the proceedings. Hearing gulls join. The air around the boat becomes populated with movement and sound. The fishermen watch the birds with attention. Birds are information. A gathering of feeding fish birds mean fish near the surface somewhere. The direction of their movement tells you something about where the fish are and which way they're heading. This is not superstition, it is genuine ecological observation, the kind of ecological literacy that comes from spending most of your waking life in an environment and paying close attention to it. After an hour, or perhaps a little more, time is approximate. Neither man has a watch, and what they know is that it has grown from dark to gray to pale light. They begin to haul the net back in. This is heavy work. The net is full of water, even when it contains no fish. And when it contains fish, it is heavier still. And the fish are tangled in the mesh and must be picked free one by one as the net comes over the side. The picking is skilled work. You must find the gill of the fish where it has caught in the mesh and ease it free without tearing the net, which is expensive to repair. And it goes slowly at first, methodically. the net piling up wet and cold in the bottom of the boat as the fish are dropped into the bowl. They are hearing this morning, not an enormous haul. There have been better mornings this season, but a decent one. Perhaps two or three baskets worth, which in this village is a respectable catch. The herring are bright silver blue in the early morning light, rigid and trembling with the last of their lives, their eyes that particular black and silver that seems lit from within. Each one is perhaps 8 or 10 inches long, dense with oil, carrying in their silvery bodies the concentrated energy of the plankton they have spent the summer eating in northern waters. The fishermen do not discuss the catch in terms of profit or loss. That framework not is not how they think about their work. What they know is that it is enough. More would have been better, less would have been concerning. This is enough to bring back to the village, enough to satisfy the obligations they carry, a portion to the Lord, a portion to the church, the rest to be kept, sold, or traded as need dictates. They turn the boat back toward shore. By the time the first boats return, the village has fully woken. The shore is a different place in the morning light than it was in the pre dawn dark. People are moving. Fires are sending their smoke up in thin columns that the sea wind immediately catches and stretches flat. Those sounds of animals and voices and tools on wood and stone fill the air. The women, and in this village's economy, the women's work of fish processing is as essential as the men's work of catching, are already at the waterfront or very close to it, waiting, not waiting passively. They have been occupied since before dawn with the morning's domestic tasks. But now the tide of the day has brought them to the shore for the next stage of work. Let's spend some time with the fisherman's wife. She is, let's say, 32 years old. She has lived in this village her entire life, as has her mother before her, as has her mother's mother. She married at 17, which was not young by the standards of her class and time. Noble and wealthy families might contract marriages much earlier, but among the working population, marriage tended to happen when a man has established himself sufficiently to support a household, which might be late 20s for men and late teens or early 20s for women who have saved or given enough in the way of household goods to contribute. Her dowry had been a good wool blanket, two linen sheets, a copper pot, and a small chest. These items still exist in the house and are still used. She is neither beautiful nor plain in the way those categories operate in the modern imagination. She is a working woman of her time, weathered by outdoor work and poor light and occasional insufficient food, but strong, genuinely strong, in the way that people who perform physical labor as a matter of daily survival are strong, with hands that have been rough since her teenage years and eyes that have spent years looking out over bright water and into wind. This morning, she has already revived the fire from banked coals, heated the pottage, fed the children, directed the older child, a girl of 9, to take the goat out to its tethering post and check the stores of salt. The salt is important. What is about to happen with the fish depends on the salt. The boats are coming in. She walks down to the waterfront with the other women of the village, carrying a large, flat wooden basket. There is a social quality to this gathering. It is the morning meeting of the village's women, an occasion for information exchange. Someone's child is ill. There is a rumor that the Lord Steward would be coming to collect the autumn levy. The miller's wife has had her baby, a girl, both well, but it does not interrupt the work. The talk happens alongside the work, as it always does in communities where work cannot stop. The boat scrape up onto the shingle. The man hand out the baskets of fish and then begins the processing. Fish that are to be eaten fresh must be used within hours in the absence of refrigeration. Fish that are to be the substance of the village's diet through the winter months, that are to be traded or sold or contributed to the Lord's household, must be preserved. And the primary method of preservation available to this village is salt. Salt at this period is not cheap. It is not as expensive as it is sometimes was in earlier centuries, but it is costly enough that it must be used carefully, efficiently, precisely. Too little and the fish will rot before it has been adequately cured. Too much and you would have wasted a resource that was obtained either by labor intensive coastal salt making or by inland trade. The women who manage the salting are exercising genuine expertise. The gutting happens first. The fish are laid out on flat stones at the water's edge, the stones worn smooth by generations of this same use and opened with a knife. The knife is short bladed and kept very sharp, because a sharp knife is faster and safer than a dull one, and speed matters when you are dealing with a large quantity of fish that must be processed before they begin to deteriorate. The motion is practiced. The knife enters just below the gills, runs down the belly, the guts are removed and thrown back into the sea, where the gulls immediately begin their aggressive competition for them. The fish is rinsed in seawater. Done. One woman can gut perhaps several hundred fish in the morning if she is experienced, and the fish are cooperative in size. Our fisherman's wife is experienced. Her daughter, who is beginning to learn the skill, will work alongside her, slower, less certain, making the small mistakes that are part of learning and that her mother corrects with brief, patient instructions. After gutting, the fish go into a wooden trough or barrel in alternating layers with salt. A layer of fish, a layer of salt, a layer of fish, a layer of salt until the barrel is full. The lid is weighted down with a stone. Over the next days and weeks, the salt will draw moisture out of the fish and dissolve into a brine, and the fish will slowly transform from something fresh and perishable into something preserved and shelf stable. Not indefinitely. Nothing is indefinitely shelf stable, but for months, which is the point. Some fish will be smoked rather than salted, or salted and then smoked. The smokehouse, if the village has one, is a low stone or wattle structure set away from the houses. The fire risk with a slow, cold fire of wood chips and sometimes seaweed inside. Fish hung in a smokehouse for days or weeks develop a different character entirely, darker, denser, with a flavor that is concentrated and complex, the taste of preservation itself. And some fish will be eaten fresh today. The waste from this morning's gutting, the heads, the offal, goes back into the sea or is saved for other uses. Fish heads, in particular, are not wasted. They can be boiled for a broth that is sustaining, if not luxurious. And in a village where nothing is wasted, they are saved. All this processing happens in the open air, at the waterfront, in community. The village's women work alongside one another, and the village's social life happens here as much as anywhere. Arguments are had and resolved. News is exchanged. Children play at the water's edge and are periodically called back from whatever dangerous thing they have found to explore. The morning passes in this mixture of labor and sociability, and when it is done, when the catch has been dealt with and barrels sealed and the work surfaces rinsed, there is a collective taking of breath, a moving on to the next task. The men, meanwhile, have been attending to the boats and the nets. Net mending is one of the those activities that sounds simple and is in fact a skilled and painstaking craft that cannot be rushed and cannot be done badly without consequence. A drift net of the type used by our fishermen might be 80 or 100 feet long, or perhaps 15 or 20 feet deep. It is made of spun flax or hemp, not nylon, which does not exist yet, twisted and knotted into a mesh. The individual knots are the essential technology. Each one must hold under the considerable tension of a net full of fish being hauled against a current. And each one must also be tied to a precise gauge so that the mesh openings are consistent and the fish of the target size will gill tangle in them properly. Each knot in the net was tied by hand. The net itself might represent weeks of labor in its original construction, and the ongoing work of maintaining it, replacing broken sections, reknotting areas where knots have slipped or the fiber has worn through, checking the floats and weights is a continuous occupation. Our fisherman sits on an overturned boat or a low wall or simply on the ground in the thin autumn sunshine, the net stretched across his knees and pulled around him in coils, and he works through it methodically. He has a small wooden shuttle, a flat tool for carrying the spare thread, and a mesh gauge, a piece of wood or bone of precise thickness against which he measures each new knot to ensure it is the right size. The work requires concentration but not urgency. It is the kind of work that accommodates the mind wandering while the hands proceed. People in communities without literacy often describe the activities of net mending or weaving or similar repetitive skilled work as a time when stories are told or songs are sung or simply when thinking happens or nothing happens, which is perhaps the same thing. The other men are doing the same nearby, a kind of collective silence punctuated by occasional exchange. Someone has a pipe, Tobacco is not known in medieval England, but pipes containing dried herbs of various kinds were sometimes used, and the smoke goes up in a thin thread into the mild morning air. The nets require perhaps 2 or 3 hours of attentive attention this morning. The section that needs repair has been dealt with, and the lead weights have been verified. The net is ready to go out again this evening if the weather holds, or tomorrow morning if not. After the nets, there is the boat to attend to. A clinker built wooden boat requires constant, small attention, seams to be caulked, the tar to be checked and renewed where it has cracked or peeled, a plank amidships that has been developing a concerning softness that needs to be investigated more seriously before the winter sets in. A boat that fails at sea is not a minor inconvenience, it is a matter of life and survival. The relationship between a fisherman and his boat is attentive and serious in ways that has nothing to do with sentimentality and everything to do with survival. The morning passes into afternoon. The middle of the day is the softest part of it for this village. The morning's heavy work is done. The afternoon's tasks have not yet accumulated their full weight. The light is at its best, which in late September means pale and golden and slightly melancholy, the kind of light that makes everything look as though it has already a memory of itself. Let us look at the village more carefully at this moment. There are, as mentioned, perhaps 40 or 50 households. Not all of them are fishing households. A village of this size, even on the coast, contains its own small ecosystem of trades and activities. There is a blacksmith, essential because iron tools and fittings need constant maintenance, and because a fishing community needs someone who can forge the small items that keep boats and nets functional. The blacksmith's forge is identifiable from its distance by its smoke, which is different from household smoke, heavier, with a metallic edge, and by the sound, when the work is active, of hammer on iron, a ringing that travels clearly on the sea air. There is a miller or access to one because grain must be ground, and the nearest windmill or watermill may be in the village itself or a short distance away. Mills at this period were not owned by the peasants who used them. They were owned by the Lord, and the peasants were obligated to use the Lord's mill, paying a toll in grain for the privilege. This toll, the multure, was a source of constant tension and occasional accusation of cheating because the miller was in a position to skim from the grain passing through his hands, and the millers in medieval literature and folklore are consistently portrayed as dishonest, a cultural accusation that probably reflects real structural conflict. There is someone who tends the village's common animals, a swineherd, a cowherd, a goose girl, and there may be dairy maid responsible for the communal dairy if the village keeps enough cattle to make that practical. On the coast, cattle are somewhat less central than inland agricultural villages. The land is often poorer and less suited to grain growing, which shifts the economic emphasis toward the sea. toward fishing and trading in fish, and toward whatever can be grown or grazed on the rougher coastal pasture. There is a priest. His house, the rectory, is attached to or adjacent to the church, which is the largest and most solidly built structure in the village. Churches at this period were not necessarily grand. Rural parish churches were often modest stone buildings, a nave, a chancel, a simple bell tower, whitewashed inside. The stone was almost always plastered and painted, not left bare as we intend to imagine, with painted images of saints and biblical scenes on the walls. These images served as a kind of visual Bible for a congregation almost entirely without literacy. The story of the Annunciation, the image of Saint Peter with his keys, the terrifying figure of Christ in judgment above the chancel arch, these were the visual vocabulary of the sacred world, familiar, present, part of the structure of reality. The priest is a man of local origin in most rural parishes, educated enough to say Mass and perform the sacraments, probably not much more. He speaks Latin well enough for the liturgy, though the quality of the rural Latin was a source of ongoing complaint among reform minded churchmen throughout the medieval period, and the village vernacular for everything else. He may or may not be celibate in practice, whatever canon law says. The enforcement of clerical celibacy was a project that was still unevenly accomplished in this period, and many rural priests had domestic arrangements that were common knowledge and that local bishops were prepared to overlook as long as everyone else was in order. His relationship with the village is complex. He is their spiritual authority, and they are linked to the universal church. He performs the rituals that mark every significant event of their lives: baptism, confirmation, marriage, last rites, burial. He takes his teeth, 1/10 of the produce of every household. In theory, true negotiation and evasion were common in practice, and in return provides spiritual services and, in many cases, a degree of practical assistance, reading and writing for those who need it, a space to resolve disputes, access to church charity in times of hardship. He is, at this midday hour, working in his small garden behind the church. Root vegetables mostly: turnips, parsnips, some kale that has survived the first cold nights. He grows what he eats, largely like everyone else. The children of the village are everywhere and nowhere in particular. The concept of childhood, as we understand it, a protected developmental period defined by schooling, play, and careful supervision, does not fully apply here. Children were understood as a smaller, less capable humans who were in the process of becoming full members of the community, and that becoming was accomplished primarily through participation in the community's work, not through any separate institution or defined curriculum. A child of 9 or 10 in this village is already working, not adult hours, not adult loads, but genuinely working, gathering fuel, driftwood from the beach, fallen branches from the coastal shrub is children's work. Fetching water from the well is children's work. Tending small animals, watching over younger siblings, running errands between households. All of this is children's work, accomplished as a matter of daily routine. The 9-year old daughter of our fisherman, as mentioned, is beginning to learn the fish gutting. She is also responsible for the family's goat during the day, leading it to its tether, checking that the rope is secure, bringing it back in the evening. She knows the goat's personality, its stubbornness, its preference for a particular patch of grass on the headland, its habits of testing the rope's fastening every morning and then acting surprised when it holds, with the attentive knowledge of a child who has been interacting with this animal daily for 2 years. Boys of this age might be helping their fathers repair nets, carrying tools, beginning the very preliminary stages of learning seamanship, how to handle a rope, how to read the simplest signals of weather, how to bail a boat. A boy of 12 or 13 might already be going out on the water in calm conditions, doing the lighter work of a crew member while the older men watch and correct. There is no formal schooling in this village. The priest might teach a handful of children their letters if they show aptitude and if their parents can spare them. The church was the primary vehicle for any literacy in rural communities at this period, and the path to any kind of advancement through literacy, becoming a clerk, eventually a priest, entering the administration of a monastery or a lord's household, ran through the church. But most children here will learn to read nothing and write nothing. And this will not be experienced as a deprivation because the community functions entirely without those skills. What you need to know, you learn by watching and doing. And what you need to remember, you remember. Because human memory in oral cultures is trained and extended in ways that literate cultures rarely require. The play of children here is vigorous and largely unsupervised by adult standards. They range for across the beach, the low headland above the village, the shallower parts of the harbor. They throw stones into the water. They build things, structures of driftwood and pebbles, small harbors and small houses, with the unconscious creativity of children who had never seen a toy store and have no concept of toys as the distinct category of objects. Everything is material, everything is potentially a game. There are games with rules, running games, catching games, games with balls of wrapped cloth or inflated bladders that have been passed down through generations of children in this community and that in their general outline are recognizable as the ancestors of games that still exist. Not every village had two tides of fishing in a day. It depended on the season, the target fish, the weather, the community's particular patterns. But in September, with herring running, it was common to go out again in the late afternoon, setting the drift net as the light faded and hauling it either at dusk or in the early evening. Our fisherman and his brother in law make their preparations in the early afternoon. The net has been checked and refolded since the morning. The boat has been bailed and gear restored. They eat something bread, more cheese, perhaps some of the morning's fresh fish, simply cooked over the fire with a little salt. And then there is a period of waiting, the tide not quite ready, the wind needing to settle. In this waiting, our fisherman does something that people in his community do with a regularity and seriousness that the modern secular mind may find difficult to fully appreciate. He goes to church, not for a service, not for any particular occasion, but the church in this period was a space of daily and casual use as much as it was a space for formal worship. People entered it to say prayers at particular hours. The rhythms of the monastic day, the canonical hours, had filtered down into lay piety, and ordinary people, while not following the full monastic schedule, might observe prime, terce, sect, nun, vespers, and compline in simplified ways, often involving prayers said before the image of their particular saint, or before the altar, or simply upon entering the building. A prayer before going out on the water was not required but was considered prudent. He enters through the slow stone doorway. The interior is dim, the windows are small, and the glass impure and greenish, filtering the light the, and cool, and smells of old incense and stone, and sometimes ineffable, that seems to be the smell of accumulated prayer itself. He takes off his hat. He stands before the painted images of Saint Nicholas, who is, among other things, the patron of sailors and fishermen. He says his prayer, which is brief and not particularly eloquent, a request for safe passage and a decent catch, delivered in the same direct, practical tone in which he would make a request of another person. This is not irreligion, it is a different mode of sacred, close, familiar, embedded in the material world. He leaves. He joins the other fishermen at the waterfront. The tide is turning. They go out again. The late afternoon on the water has a quality quite different from the morning. The light, for one thing, by late September, the sun is already low by 3 in the morning, dropped toward the southwestern horizon with an urgency that the summer sun lacks entirely. The light is amber and horizontal, catching the surface of the sea in a way that makes the water look heavier, more substantial, almost solid. Every ripple throws a small shadow. The fishing boats on the water, there are 4 or 5 out this afternoon, spread across the inshore area that they collectively know, are dark cutouts against the luminous surface. The drift net goes out as before. The boat is made fast to its end. They drift. In the evening light, the birds are different. Gannets, beautiful, impractical bird looking birds, white and black wingtips with that absurd knife of a beak and the peculiar cold gold of their eye, are working the water half a mile ashore, and their diving is visible even at that distant. A gannet's dive is remarkable. The bird climbs to 50 or 100 feet, folds its wings, and drops vertically, entering the water with barely a splash and reaching depths that no other European seabird can match. The fishermen watch them with a professional interest. Gannets over a shoal is useful information, but the birds are to the south of where the net is, and the net is already set, and moving the net is not a quick process, so they stay. They talk more in the evening, these two men. The morning's quiet was the quiet of pre dawn focus. The evening's quiet is more relaxed. The quiet of two people who know each other very well and whose talk is a talk of long familiarity. They talk about the coming winter, whether to repair the east wall of the fisherman's house before the cold sets in or whether it can wait until spring. The conversation is practical and long, moving through the details of the decision with the thoroughness that comes from knowing that the decision matters. Stone must be found or purchased. The labor is a question of time and who can be persuaded to help. The cost against the consequence of a cold wall through January. It is decided that the wall will be patched this autumn, if possible, rebuilt more substantially in the spring. They talk about the brother in law's situation. He is at 28, still unmarried, which is beginning to attract notice. There is a girl in a village 2 miles up the coast who is being considered. Her father is a net maker, which would be a useful connection. The conversation is oblique and unsentimental by modern standards. Feelings are discussed, but they are discussed in terms of practical significance rather than as things to be explored for their own sake. Is the girl capable? Is the father reasonable? What would be the arrangement look like? The brother in law is not uninterested in the girl personally. That much is clear from the way he speaks about her, though the words he uses are not romantic. This is not because he has no inner life, but because the vocabulary and the conventions for expressing that inner life are different from our own. The net is hauled in the gathering dusk. Another good catch, not as large as the morning's, but solid. The silver flash of herring against the dark water as they come over the gunwale, the weight of the net, the methodical picking free of each fish, the work and the light fading together. They row back to the shore in the near dark. The village is lit from within, hearth fires, and here and there is the dim glimmer of a tallow candle, and the smoke is thicker, and now as the evening fires are built up, the smell of it reaches them on the water before they reach the shore. The village contracts in the evening. This is a physical and psychological contraction. As the light goes, the village outside the firelight becomes less accessible, less real. The family gathers in the warmth of the hearth, and the hearth is the center of everything: heat, light, cooking, the social unit of the family in its most elemental form. The evening meal is the largest of the day, though largest is relative. The pottage that has been simmering on the fire all day, added to periodically, amended, the earlier batch absorbed and transformed, is ladled into wooden bowls. Bread, if there is any, which there usually is, a round loaf of coarse dark bread, heavy with bran, dense in a way that modern bread is not, made from whatever grain the family had access to. In a fishing village, bread might not be the staple it was in an inland agricultural community. The diet here is more heavily weighted toward fish, both fresh and preserved, but bread is bread and it is eaten. The family eats together. In many illustrations and records of medieval peasant life, the family gathering at the hearth for the evening meal is the central social image of domestic life. The children are there, tired from the day's work and play. The fisherman's wife is there, having managed the domestic world all day and with the same thoroughness that her husband managed the world of fishing. The fisherman is there, tired in his back and his hands, gratified by a reasonable day's catch, present. They do not eat in silence, but they do not eat in the way that what a modern family might eat, with electronic entertainment competing for attention. They eat and they talk about the day, about the children, about the immediate future, about the small crises and resolutions of daily life. The 9-year old has something to say about the goat, who has apparently developed an opinion about the quality of the grass on the south side of the teetering post. The younger child has an argument with a neighbor's child and that needs some parental diplomatic intervention. The fisherman's wife has news about the waterfront filtered through the morning's communal work session. After eating, the fire is banked for the night. Tallow dips, crude candles made from animal fat, much smokier and dimmer than beeswax candles, which are preserved for church use, might burn for an hour or two. In this time, the evening's quiet activities happen. The mothers might spin, her spindle dropping and rising in the firelight, producing the thread that will eventually become cloth. The fisherman might work on a small repair, a splice in a rope, a piece of leather equipment that needs attention. The children, fighting sleep, might be told a story. The story, if one is told, is not written down. It exists only in its telling, and it will be retold and reshaped with each subsequent telling, and it will be eventually take forms that no one in this room would quite recognize. The stories that circulate in this community are a mixture. Local stories about particular places and their histories, why the big rock at the north end of the beach is called what it is called, what happened to the family that used to live in the ruined house on the cliff top, religious stories, simplified and dramatized retellings of saints' lives and biblical events, and the older, stranger stories that seem to predate Christianity entirely. Stories about what lives in the deep water and what appears on the cliffs in certain kinds of weather, and what you should and should not do at particular times of year. The children sleep before the story is finished. They are carried to their pallets. The adults sit a while longer in the dimming light. Before we settle into the deeper quiet of the night, it is worth spending some time with the economic structure within which this village exists, because it shapes everything that happens here, sometimes invisibly. The village is not self governing, it exists within a feudal hierarchy that, while it may feel abstract and distant on an ordinary September day, is as real and consequential as the weather. At the top of this hierarchy, in theory, is the king. Beneath him are the great lords, earls, and barons who hold their lands in exchange for military service and other obligations. Beneath them are the lesser lords, knights, and minor nobility who hold smaller territories in exchange for service to the greater lords. And at the base of the whole structure are the peasants, villagers like our fisherman and his family, who hold their land and their fishing rights from the Lord in exchange for labor, services, and payment in kind. The lord of this manor, the territorial unit that includes this village and the surrounding land, is probably a knight or a minor nobleman who lives in a hall some miles away. He is not a villager. He does not fish. He may visit this village occasionally to collect his dues or inspect his property, but his life is entirely different from the lives of the people who live and work here. He has military obligations to fulfill, a political relationships to manage, a household to maintain that operates on a different scale and with different consumption patterns than anything the villagers know. What the Lord wants from this village is broadly three things: labor, produce, and money. The labor takes the form of obligatory work on the Lord's land, plowing, harvesting, carting, building, for a certain number of days per year. This is the corvée, and it is one of the features of villain status and the most clearly distinguishes the unfree peasant from the free one. A villain must work for the Lord, whether the timing is convenient or not, whether there is other urgent work to be done or not. The Lord's needs take precedence. The produce takes the form of payments in kind, portions of the catch for a fishing community, grain from agricultural communities, specific items that the Lord claims by custom, the best animal when a villager dies, the harriet, a payment when a daughter marries, the merchant, a tax on grounds grain, the mulcher. These are not negotiated, they are customary, which means they have the force of tradition and are enforced by the manorial court. The manorial court is where the legal life of the village is managed. It meets periodically, several times a year, and deals with disputes between villagers, infractions of the Lord's rule, and the recording of transfers of land and livestock. It is presided over the Lord's representative, the steward or bailiff, and the jurors are drawn from the village's more substantial householders. The records of manorial courts, where they survive, are one of the richest sources of details of ordinary medieval life because they contain the evidence of actual disputes, actual transactions, actual human beings arguing about actual problems. For our fisherman's family, the Lord's claim manifests most immediately in the levy of fish. A certain portion of every catch, the exact amount fixed by custom and occasionally contested, goes to the Lord. It is delivered either directly to the Lord's household, which would be nearby enough to make this practical, or converted into cash payments through sale. This portion is not optional, and is not contingent on the catch being large. If the catch is small, the portion is still owed. This is one of the features of the system that produced genuine hardship in bad seasons. Obligations fixed by custom do not flex to accommodate natural variation. The church, too, has its claim. The tithe, 1/10 of produce, is theoretically absolute, though in practice, tithing of fish was a complicated matter, subject to local custom and negotiation. The priest takes his portion, the regional church takes its portion. The soul of the community is secured in theory by these payments. What remains after these obligations is what the family lives on. In a good season, this is enough. Enough to eat, enough to salt and store for winter, perhaps a small surplus to sell or trade for things the household cannot produce itself. In a bad season, it is insufficient, and the gap must be filled somehow by reducing consumption, by drawing on whatever reserves exist, by accepting charity from the church or from neighbors who are doing somewhat better, or in the worst case, by the slow deterioration of health and capacity that is the real face of medieval poverty. The people of this village are not isolated in the sense of having no knowledge of the world beyond their coast. They are connected through trade, through the church, through occasional travel, through the movement of information along well established human networks, to a world that extends well beyond their immediate horizon. The fish they catch will travel. Salted herring from the coast of England or the North Sea or Baltic moved enormous distances in the medieval economy, preserved well enough to be traded hundreds of miles inland, eaten at aristocratic tables, served in monastery refectories, sold at fairs in cities in the fishermen themselves will never visit. The fisherman's product participates in a market that, in its scope, genuinely European. What comes in return? Salt, as mentioned, iron for tools and fittings, cloth in quantities that the village cannot produce itself, pottery, occasionally luxury goods that filter down from the higher riches of the economy, a piece of colored glass, a fragment of expensive dye, something that was traded at a fair and passed through its several hands before arriving here. The trade flows through the nearest town, which might be a day's walk or a short boat ride away. The town has a market held on specific days of the week, and the village's surplus, fish, salt fish, perhaps some coastal products like seaweed used in certain processes, perhaps some craft items, goes to the market and comes back as cash or as the goods the village needs. The fisherman who makes this journey to market are the village's most cosmopolitan members in a relative sense. They have seen the town, they know its layout, its market stalls, its people. They have heard news from the merchants and traders who pass through the town's market, news from the capital, news from the coast, news from whatever the latest crises in the perpetual human drama of wars and successions and famines and plagues is currently located. The village knows about the king in a general way. They know the king's name, though they might not know his face, since portraits of royalty were not disseminated to the general population, and they know, in a vague way, that he is their ultimate lord. They might not know about the current state of wars, if there are wars, because wars affect the economy in ways that reach even to fishing villages. They change the price of goods. They sometimes draft young men. They disrupt the trade networks through which things flow. In 1320, England has recently experienced the disastrous campaigns of Edward II in Scotland, and the failures and tensions of that era are part of the general awareness even in remote places. They know about the Pope even more vaguely. The Church, of which they are daily members, is a universal institution that reaches from Rome to the stone church on this windy coast. And the Pope is its head, and its decisions made in Rome eventually become the pronouncement read from local pulpits. If there is a theological controversy, and there's always a theological controversy, its echoes reach here in simplified filtered form. But mostly the village knows itself, its own personalities and histories, its own landscapes and weathers, its own rhythms and routines. The wider world is real, but distant, like the gannets working the water half a mile offshore. Interesting, occasionally consequential, but most relevant when it enters the immediate space of daily life. Let us spend some time with what happens when someone in this village falls ill. The medical resources available to a fishing village in the 14th century are not nothing, but they are not what we would recognize as medicine. There are no hospitals. The nearest hospital in the modern sense would be a religious foundation in the nearest city, and it would not resemble a modern hospital in function or in what it could offer. There are no doctors in the village. Qualified physicians existed in the cities and in the households of the wealthy, but they were expensive, inaccessible, and often limited practical use in any case. There is no trained apothecary. What there is a set of practical folk remedies passed through down through the generations, a herbalist's knowledge possessed by certain individuals in the community, usually women, usually older women who had accumulated knowledge through experience and instruction, and the healing resources of the church. The village herbalist, let's call her a wise woman, though the term has accrued associations in the modern imagination that aren't quite right for this context, is an older woman, perhaps in her 50s, who lives alone or with a dependent relative at the edge of the village. She is not a witch. The figure of the medieval village witch, as imagined in later folklore and popular culture, is a projection backwards from the witch trial panic of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. In 1320, the category is not yet fully formed, and the wise woman is more likely to be regarded with a mixture of respect and cautious distance than reflects her unusual role as a specialist in knowledge that most people do not have. What she knows, which plants in which preparations have which effects. Willow bark tree tea for fever, which works because willow bark contains salicin, the precursor of aspirin. Garlic for infection, which has genuine antiseptic properties. Honey as a wound dressing, which is genuinely antimicrobial. Valerian and hops for sleep. Various preparations for stomach complaints, for joint pain, for headache. Some of these work, some don't, some are harmful. The distinction between what is efficacious and what is ritual or placebo is not one she has the tools to make, and the two are intertwined in her practice in ways that are simply the normal state of pre scientific medicine. She also knows how to set bones roughly, though for complex fractures were often beyond her and become infections and deaths. She knows how to deliver babies, which is the primarily obstetric role in the village. There is no doctor present at births, and there are only other women, and the wise woman is the one whose experience is most trusted. She knows about the management of pregnancy and the immediate postpartum period, knowledge accrued from long experience that includes both successes and losses. Childbirth in this period was genuinely dangerous. The rate of maternal mortality was significantly higher than in modern high income countries, and the deaths of women in childbirth were a regular feature of the village life, sufficiently common that they have constituted one of the great leveling facts of women's experience across class boundaries. For serious illness, illness that folk remedies cannot address, the village turns to the church, not in the sense of abandoning practical medicine, but alongside it. Prayer, votive offerings to particular saints, attendance at healing shrines if the poor person is well enough to travel, rituals of anointing and intersection. These are not considered alternatives to the practical. They are the same thing, part of the same integrated worldview in which the physical and the spiritual are not fully separable. The sick person lay in the family home, cared for by family members. The concept of isolating infectious cases was not unknown. Certain diseases, particularly leprosy, were associated with formal exclusion, but for most illnesses, care was domestic and communal. The neighbors came, broth was made, prayers were said, the priest came to administer the last rites when it seemed appropriate, and then the illness resolved itself one way or the other. This description should not make medieval medicine seem merely grim. There was genuine knowledge in it, and genuine care, and the human presence at the bedside of the sick was not nothing. Modern medicine can extend and repair life in ways that medieval medicine could not approach. Medieval care could offer presence and comfort in ways that modern institutions sometimes fail. The comparison is not flattering in either direction. Our day in the fishing village in a single September day, but to understand it fully, we need to understand its place in a larger cycle. The medieval year was structured in ways quite different from the modern calendar. The two great structuring systems were the agricultural fishing cycle and the church calendar, and they were not entirely separate. The church calendar grew up in part to overlay and Christianize older seasonal celebrations, and the result was a year of full of feast days and fast days that marked the rhythms of the agricultural and the fishing world as much as they mark theological events. September, where we are, is a time of relative abundance. The summer's fishing has been good, and the harvest is either just finished or completing. The stores are being laid in. The weather is deteriorating from the benign summer pattern but has not yet reached the extremes of winter. There's a quality to September in the fishing village that is almost comfortable, a satisfaction in the work done, a readying for the harder season ahead, a fullness of produce and preserved food that the midwinter will not provide. The great September feast is Michaelmas, the feast of Saint Michael and all angels, which falls on September 29th. It is one of the four quarter days, the points in the year at which rents and debts are reckoned and at which seasonal labor contracts begin and end, at which the formal accounting of the agricultural year is done. Michaelmas is also associated in popular tradition with the eating of geese that have fattened through the summer or on harvest stubble, and with the general taking of stock before the winter. It is a threshold day marking the transition from the more open season to the more enclosed one. Coming up after the Michaelmas is the autumn cycle of preserving and preparation. The remaining fish from the late season runs are salted. Animals that will not be kept through the winter are slaughtered and the meat salted or smoked. Martinmas, November 11th, the feast of Saint Martin, was traditionally by the time of for the autumn slaughter. The wood stores are checked, the thatch is inspected, the seeds for next year's garden are put away in dry storage. Then winter, December's short days and long cold nights, and fishing curtailed by bad weather for weeks at a time. The village turned inward, the stores drawn down steadily, monitoring against the remaining weeks of winter. January and February are the hungry months. The stores are lowest. The new growth has not begun. The sea fishing is limited by weather and the absence of the great summer shoals. The village has survived many winters. It knows how to survive this one, but the knowledge is not comforting exactly because every winter has its unexpected hardships. And then spring, April, the return of the spring fish runs. May, the beginning of the growing season in earnest. June, the long northern days. The sea at its calmest and most generous. The year turning again. This cycle has governed life in this village for as long as anyone can remember, and for as long before that as there has been a village here. It will continue to govern it for generations after the people we are spending this day with has been buried in the churchyard and have become in the formal record nothing more than names on stone or no names at all, which is more common. A grave without a stone, without a marker, the body given back to the earth without commemoration. The second night is coming. The autumn evening closes in faster than the summer one. By 6 o'clock, not that anyone here uses that formulation, but by the time of the last daylight has left the sky, the village is interior. The hearth fires are the world. The sounds outside are the sea and the wind and occasionally the dogs, and occasionally something that is probably the wind but sounds like something else. The darkness outside a pre modern village was not empty. This is something that modern people who have grown up in environments of abundant artificial light rarely appreciate with a full bodily understanding. The darkness outside the firelight was complete, and in that completeness, It was inhabited by the whatever mind and culture brought to it. This was a world that believed in things we do not believe in, not naively. The people in the medieval village was not simple or credulous in ways that distinguished them fundamentally from us, but differently. The category of the supernatural was real, present, continuous with the natural world rather than sharply separated from it. Fairies, not the delicate winged creatures of Victorian imagination, but something older and more ambivalent, more dangerous, more likely to steal children and leave changelings and lead travelers astray on familiar paths, were present in the landscape. The spirits of unquiet dead could return, particularly at certain times of the year. The deep water held things. The cliff paths were not safe at night. These beliefs were not incompatible with Christianity. They coexisted with it, sometimes uneasily, sometimes in a kind of pragmatic synthesis. You went to church on Sunday, and you also observed the older precautions, because the older precautions had been working for a very long time and you were not going to abandon them merely because a priest said they were superstitious. The priest might grumble, but he often observed some of the precautions himself. The fisherman and his wife, settling to sleep in the firelit room with their children, are not afraid of the dark in a paralyzing way. They know the dark. They live with it from September to March in long, regular acquaintance. But they respect it. The door is latched. The fire is banked with care. A certain prayer is said, and as it is said every night, asking for the night's protection. Small practical magics are not entirely absent. A piece of iron near the door, because iron is traditionally inimical to the more mischievous supernatural entities. A particular word said over the sleeping children, not a formal prayer, but something older, something that a grandmother taught, and then sleep. The household sleeps. The fire breathes quietly. The sea continues its eternal commentary on the shore. The dogs shift in their places. The night holds everything in its large, indifferent hand. The village, the boats on the beach, the salted fish in the barrels, the nets hanging in the darkness, the sea, the coast, the whole small human world built on this edge of things and keeps holding it as the hours pass. The fish themselves deserve some attention. They are not background, they are the reason for this village's existence. The North Sea and the coastal waters of northern Europe in the 14th century were enormously productive. The fish populations have not been subjected to the industrial scale exploitation that the 19th and 20th centuries would bring. The fishery was large, resilient, diverse. There were herring in quantities that observers described with astonishment. Shoals so dense that a boat moving through them could be impeded. The waters dark with bodies, the surface boiling. Herring was the backbone of the medieval fish economy, particularly in the North Sea. They ran in enormous seasonal shoals, predictable enough in their timing and location to be the basis of annual affairs. The great herring fairs at Yarmouth and Scarborough and the Baltic ports were among the largest commercial gatherings in Northern Europe. The Hanseatic merchants who dominated the Baltic trade built their prosperity substantially on salted herring. The Dutch Golden Age of the 17th century was preceded and enabled by Dutch control of the North Sea herring fishery. Herring were, in a very real sense, one of the foundations of Northern European civilization. What else did the village fish for? God, cod. When they could reach the cod grounds, which might require larger boats and longer voyages than the inshore operations we've been watching, cod dried without salt, stockfish made in the cold, dry air of Scandinavia was another major trading commodity, and its value lay precisely in its long shelf life. Dried cod could last for years if kept dry, and it provided a dense protein source that was essential to the nutrition of people through the lean months. The trade in stockfish from Norway and Iceland to the rest of Europe was one of the defining economic flows of the medieval period. Plaice, sole, and other flatfish were taken from the sandy bottoms of inshore waters with smaller nets or with lines. Mackerel were a summer fish, fast and rich, less durable than herring, but caught in similar methods. Eels were extremely important, particularly in freshwater communities near rivers, but coastal villages also had access to sea run eels and shellfish. The rocky parts of the coast provided oysters, mussels, limpets, whelks, food that required no boat, no net, only a basket and the willingness to work at low tide. In a coastal community, the shellfish beds were a supplement of real importance. Oysters, now considered a luxury, were so common in medieval diet that they appeared in the kitchen middens, the rubbish heaps of old settlements, in such quantities that they clearly constituted a significant part of the ordinary diet. An oyster was not a treat, it was a meal or part of one. The fishing technology of the period was varied and sophisticated. Beyond drift nets, there were seine nets, which were drawn round a school of fish and then pulled close. Pound nets, fixed traps, stick nets woven into the tidal zone, fish weirs, stone or wooden structures built in rivers and tidal channels that trapped fish on the falling tide. The fish trap, in particular, was an ancient technology going back long before medieval times, and the construction and the maintenance of fish weirs was often one of the most specific obligations of certain villages under the manorial system. The Lord's weir, tended by the Lord's villagers, producing the Lord's fish. The knowledge required to make all of this work, knowledge of tides, of currents, of the behavior of specific fish species, of the seasonal patterns that governed where fish were and when, was accumulated over lifetimes and generations and constituted in its totality an ecological intelligence that was specific, practical, and profound. The fishermen of this village knew their local sea in ways that cannot be reduced to any document, any record. The knowledge lived in them. We have touched on the fisherman's wife and her work, but the domestic economy of this village warrants more careful attention because it was the dimension of life that kept everyone alive in the most direct sense. The household was an economic unit as well as a family, and its management was the woman's responsibility. This is not sentimentalizing, it was genuinely demanding, complex, skillful work. The domestic economy of a medieval village household required competence in a range of specific, specialized activities: cooking, bread making, brewing, dairy work if applicable, the raising of small animals, the spinning and weaving of cloth, the care of the sick, the preservation of food, the management of the household finances, such as they were, the supervision of children's work and development. None of this was simple. All of it was consequential. The spinning, particularly, was an enormous ongoing labor. All the cloth used in the household for clothing, for bedding, for working equipment was either made at home or purchased. And purchase required money, which required surplus, and surplus was not always available. So cloth was made, raw fiber, wool, principally. True flax for linen was also grown and processed, was cleaned, carded, or combed to align the fibers, then spun into a thread using a drop spindle. The spinning wheel, while it existed in some form, was not yet the standard domestic implementation it would later become in England, and the thread was woven into cloth on a loom. A drop spindle is a simple tool, a stick with a weighted disc at one end, which is set spinning and then dropped. The twist of the spindle twisting the drawn out fiber into thread as the spindle falls. It is slow, but it is portable and requires no special space, so it could be done while walking, while tending animals, while sitting by the fire in the evening. A woman might carry her spindle constantly, spinning whenever her hands were otherwise free. The resulting thread would be taken to a weaver. Many villages had a weaver or had access to one in the nearest town, or woven at home on a simple loom. The cloth that resulted was coarse by modern standards, uneven, heavier than modern woven cloth, sometimes undyed, the natural gray brown of wool, sometimes dyed with whatever local plant materials were available. Welt for yellow, woad for blue, madder for red, though the brighter dyes required mordants and knowledge. The wife in this household is an accomplished spinner. She has been spinning since she was a child. It is as natural to her as walking. In the evenings, while others are winding down towards sleep, her hands often continue to move. This is There is something meditative in the motion of the spindle, in the steady drawing out of the fiber, in the slight resistance that tells you when the twist is right and when you are going too fast and the thread will break. She also brews ale, the small beer of the household, weak daily, was brewed in batches in the household, usually by women. The processed grain, barley, or sometimes oats or mixed grain, is malted by soaking it until it begins to sprout and then drying it, which activates the enzymes and will convert the starches to sugars. The malted grain is mashed in hot water to extract the sugars, and the resulting liquid, wort, is boiled with whatever bittering agent is locally available. Hops were beginning to be used in England in this period, having come from the continent, but gruit, a mixture of herbs including bog myrtle, yarrow, and others, was still common, and then cooled and fermented with yeast. The yeast might come from the previous batch, kept alive in a piece of old bread, or from wild sources. The resulting ale is consumed quickly. It does not keep well without hops. A fresh batch is made frequently. The cooking itself is done over the open fire with a limited range of equipment. A cauldron suspended over from an iron pot hook over the flames for the daily pottage, a griddle stone or clay vessel for baking small flatbreads, occasionally a clay pot buried in the embers for slow cooking. Without an oven, bread in the proper sense, risen loaves baked in enclosed space, was made less often and required either a communal oven, Some villages had these, shared among several households, or a clay pot oven heated with coals. The pottage, as mentioned, is the daily staple, a thick porridge, stew that contains whatever is available. In September, this might include dried peas or beans from the summer garden, preserved fish, fresh fish when available, root vegetables, wild herbs gathered from the headland and the margins of fields, sorrel, nettles, goose foot, various species that were no longer commonly eaten but which were standard components of the medieval diet and which were not merely survival food but genuinely nutritious. The diet here is not luxurious, but it is not starvation. In a good year, with fish plentiful, a coastal village are ate better than many inland communities. We should spend a little more time with the church because its presence in the life of this village is not merely formal, it is pervasive. The church bell, and this village does have a bell, cast bronze, hanging in a small stone tower, rings throughout the day. The canonical hours, matins, or at night, vigils, lauds at dawn, prime at sunrise, terce at mid morning, sect at noon, none in mid afternoon, vespers at evening, compline before sleep. These are monastic hours, properly speaking, but they have filtered down into lay awareness in simplified form. The bell rings and the people register what time it is, what part of the day's structure they are in. The sound of the bell carries across the village and in clear weather, some distance out to sea. For the fishermen on the water, the bell is a connection to the land, to the community, to the structure of the day. They may not be able to observe the hours formally. They are on the water, but they hear the bell and they know. Inside the church, something is almost always present. Even the priest is not there conducting a formal service. People come and go throughout the day to pray at the images of their particular saints, to light a candle in thanks for favor received, or in hope of one to come, to sit in the cool stone quiet for a few minutes when the world's noise becomes too much, to attend to the business of the devotional life that is as natural and ordinary to them as breathing. The image deserves attention. The church walls are painted, not professionally, not by artists from the capital, but by regional craftsmen who brought with them a tradition of sacred image making that goes back centuries. The figures of the saints are stylized, elongated, formal, with large eyes that seem to meet yours regardless of where you stand, and they are painted in the vivid colors that are available, pigments permitted: ochre, red lead, malachite green, azurite blue. The blue particularly was valuable and expensive because the finest blue pigment, ultramarine, made from ground lapis lazuli, came from Afghanistan and had been traded across the known world for centuries. A painted Madonna in blue in a rural church represented real economic value translated into devotion. St. Nicholas is prominent for obvious reasons in a fishing community. St. Clement is there too, patron of sailors and the sea, with his characteristic anchor, the instrument of his legendary martyrdom, thrown into the sea with an anchor tied to him, the story goes, and then miraculously preserved. Saint Catherine with her wheel, the Virgin Mary in her blue, in the most prominent position, because in this period, Marian devotion is at one of its high points in popular practice, and the Virgin is understood to be more accessible intercessor than her son, more likely to soften the severity of divine judgment, more likely to respond to ordinary human need. The priest holds Mass in the morning. It is low Mass, no choir, no elaborate ceremonial, just the priest and the altar and the words in Latin and the mystery at the center of it, which is the same mystery that is enacted simultaneously at cathedrals and in tiny oratories across the entire Christian world, in all of its theological weight and simplicity, the bread becoming the body and the wine becoming the blood, the eternal sacrifice made present again in this stone room smelling of damp and candle wax on this September morning. The villagers attend, not necessarily all of them, every day, but Sunday Mass is obligatory and the feast days are observed. The attendance, by modern standards, probably not very attentive. The Mass is in Latin, which no one except the priest understands more than fragmentally, and it is conducted with the priests backing to the congregation facing the altar. The congregation participates by being present, by their physical attendance, by saying their own private prayers while the priest conducts the liturgy at the altar. This is not disengagement, it is a different understanding of participation, one in which presence and the shared physical space of the sacred are the medium of the religious act. Every few weeks, the more frequently in the busy autumn trading season, someone from the village makes the journey to the nearest market town. The journey is not long by the modern reckoning, perhaps 8 or 10 miles, but it is significant. You go on foot. If you have a horse or a donkey, which most villages here do not, or on horseback, you carry your goods in baskets or on a pack frame. The path is a long road in the medieval sense, a right way of that has been worn smooth by long use, maintained imperfectly by the obligation of adjacent landowners to keep, if passable, unpaved, muddy in wet seasons and dusty in dry, rutted spaces where heavy carts have passed repeatedly. You are not alone in this road. Medieval roads were surprisingly busy, even rural ones. Traders with their pack animals, pilgrims heading to a nearby shrine, or not so nearby, pilgrimages were one of the forms of long distance travel that ordinary people undertook. The road to Canterbury or to the Holy Well at the next country's boundaries was well trodden. Itinerant craftsmen, tinkers, scissor grinders, peddlers of pins and thread and small necessities, Medican friars, Franciscan and Dominicans, traveling preachers who supported themselves by begging and moved constantly through the countryside, making themselves useful at parish and churches, and providing a kind of theological update service between the major church institutions and the rural population. Laborers looking for work. The road is a social space as well as a route. The market town, when you reach it, is a different world from the village. Towns in this period range from the very small to genuinely large, and even a small market town of perhaps 1,000 people would feel dense and active after the village. The streets are narrow and unpaved, overhung by the upper floors of timber framed buildings that lean toward one another across the narrow gap. The noise is considerable, the sound of trades being practiced, a smith's hammer, a carpenter's saw, the cries of market vendors, the sounds of animals, cattle being driven to the butcher, horses being shot at the farrier, the sounds of people, a lot of people engaged in a simultaneous transaction on the market day. The market is held in a central square along the main village. Stalls set up in rows or clusters by type. the fishmongers together, the cloth merchants together, the food vendors together. The fish stall run by someone from our village is modest. A few baskets of salted herring, some smoked fish, perhaps some fresh, if the timing works out. The prices are negotiated face to face, haggled, agreed upon. There's no price list, and the fluctuations of supply and demand are managed through the direct interactions of buyers and sellers. What comes back to the village? Salt, purchased from a salt merchant who has obtained it from a coastal salt making operations or from imports, iron nails and small fittings, a length of hempen rope, coarse linen cloth, a few items of hardware, occasionally something more, a small luxury, a piece of pottery from distant kiln, a religious trinket from a peddler. Money, if the fish sold well, silver pennies, worn smooth from handling, whose silver content and authenticity are judged by weight and appearance rather than by any marking, because the currency system at this point is still imperfect, and coinage from different mints and different periods circulate simultaneously. The market is also a place of information. The news that circulates through the village over the following days about the state of the trade, about the political situation, about the condition of the communities reached by the traders of the market originates here, gathered from the wider network of travelers and traders that converges at this weekly point. We have spent the day with a fisherman in his middle years, but what of those who are older? The villages has its old people, not many. The age structure of pre-modern communities was weighted heavily towards youth, for the simple reason that mortality was high across all age groups, but particularly among children. But some people did reach what we would call old age, and their experience is worth considering. An old woman in this village, she is perhaps 60, which here constitutes genuine old age, and an age that only a minority reached, has lived through the entirety of the village's life for the last 60 years. She has seen bad years, a winter in her childhood so severe that the fish were absent for months and the village nearly starved, a summer plague in her early middle age, not the Black Death, which comes later in 1348, but one of the regular outbursts of epidemic diseases that swept through the medieval Europe in waves that killed three of her children and left her with a grief that shaped everything subsequent. A fire that destroyed several houses, including hers, the year before her marriage. She has seen good years too, seasons of abundance, celebrations at the church, moments of communal joy at which the villagers shared life, expressed something genuinely festive and free. She no longer fishes. She no longer does the heavy work of gutting and salting. Her hands, which worked every day for 60 years, ache in a way that makes fine motor tasks difficult. But she is not useless. The category of useless old person is a luxury of wealthy societies that cannot afford to carry non productive members. In a village like this, everyone contributes what they can, and what she can contribute is considerable. She knows things. The entire living memory of the village resides in her and in the oldest members of the community. They are the archive, the record, the institutional memory of a community without writing. She knows which of the Lord's demands are customary and which are innovations that can be resisted. She knows this because she remembers what the demands were 40 years ago and what the rule was right before that, passed down from her own grandmother. This knowledge is not trivial. It is the basis of whatever negotiating power the village has in its dealings with the manorial system. She knows the medicinal plants. She knows the old stories. She knows the deep history of the village's families, who is related to whom, whose house hath claimed on which pieces of land, whose grandmother died in what circumstances, and what that means for a particular ongoing dispute. In a society without written records at the local level, this kind of remembered knowledge is the functional equivalent of an archive. Her day is quieter than it used to be. She sits near the fire more. She minds the youngest children from their mothers are occupied. She tells stories. She advises. She intercedes in disputes with the calm authority of someone who has seen enough to know that most disputes are less important than they seem, and they have generally resolved themselves into something both parties can live with. She will die here, in this village, in this community, attended by the people she has known all her life. The priest will come, the prayers will be said, and then she will be buried in the churchyard, the same churchyard where her children are buried, where her husband was buried, where her parents are buried, and where the generations pile up quietly in the earth. And the village will continue as it always has, and it always will for as long as villages like this persist. We are coming back to the night and to sleep. The medieval body's relationship with sleep was different from the modern one, and it is genuinely interesting enough to linger on. The historian A. Roger Etheridge, in his work on pre industrial sleep, documented something remarkable. Before the advent of artificial lighting, people in temperate climates commonly slept in two distinct periods, separated by an hour or more of wakefulness in the middle of the night. This pattern, sometimes called segmental sleep or bimodal sleep, appeared to have been normal across a wide range of pre industrial cultures, and it is evidenced in historical documents by the matter of fact references to first sleep and second sleep as distinct phases. In the first sleep, which began relatively early in the evening, perhaps an hour or two after dark, people slept deeply. Then, in the small hours, they woke for a period that historical records describe as being used for prayer, for reflection, for quiet conversation, for reading, if literate, if there was light, for intimacy, for getting up and doing small tasks by candlelight. Then they returned to sleep, the second sleep, and woke with the dawn or shortly before it. This pattern may persist in our fishing village. The fisherman and his wife, lying in the dark after banking the fire, might sleep until the small hours, then lie awake for a time. What do they think about in this interstitial wakefulness? The same things that people have always thought about in the vulnerable honesty of the middle of the night. The children, the state of the stores, whether the repairs to the wall will be adequate before winter, whether the brother-in-law will make a good marriage, the ache in the back that is getting worse, the prayer that comes naturally in the quiet, the gratitude for what is good, the worry about what might go wrong, and then eventually the slide back into sleep, the second sleep, which is said to have a particular quality, deeper, in some accounts more dream rich. The body's second passage through the night, now thoroughly warm under the wool blankets, the fire's low warmth radiating from the bank coals, the sound of the sea a constant presence at the edge of consciousness. The children sleep without interruption, the way children sleep completely, trustingly, their bodies and minds surrounding to rest in a way that adults sometimes struggle to achieve. Their breathing is the breathing of creatures fully at ease in the world. The house is very quiet. The village is very quiet. The sea continues. The people of this village have been gone for 700 years. What remains of them? Beneath the turf of any medieval coasting site, if the excavators were to dig carefully, they would find the post holes of buildings, the pattern of where the vertical timbers stood, invisible now except as darker stains in the subsoil, the hearthstone still bearing the heat cracking of the centuries of fire, ash, carbonized bone, the residues of cooking, the rubbish pits, middens, where the villagers' waste was deposited, and which contains the most direct record of daily life, animal bones, fish bones, the species represented, the sizes, the marks of butchering and processing, fragmentary pottery, the occasional items of metal or bone, seeds of the plants that were eaten or they grew in the village's garden. The fish bones are particularly eloquent. An analysis of medieval coastal sites, fish's bones assemblages, can tell you which species were being caught, at what sizes, at which times of year, at with what kind of equipment. It can tell you about the changes in fishing practices over time, the shift from certain species to others as populations fluctuated, and about the diet of the community in extraordinary detail. But the bones do not tell you everything. They do not tell you about the stories told in the evenings. They do not tell you about the particular quality of the optimum light on the water, or the ache in the fisherman's back, or the sound of the children's playing at the water's edge. They do not tell you about the conversations between the women at the waterfront, or the prayers said before this image of Saint Nicholas, or the feeling of the fire's warmth over a cold morning on the water. Those things are gone. They were always temporary, always existing only in their moment of happening. 700 years is simply the interval since the last moment of their happening. And yet, we are here in this darkened room, following the path of a day that ended before anyone was alive was born. We are attending to it. We are, in some small way, continuing the chain of human attention that includes the priest recording the tithe, the tax collector noting the village's name in his account book, the archaeologist digging carefully through the ash of the old hearth. We are remembering something that was always in its daily texture unremarkable, and finding in that unremarkability not poverty of content but a particular kind of richness, the richness of life lived in its material specificity, in its relationship and routines, in its embodied engagement with the world. The village will sleep through the rest of the September night. The sea will continue. The nets will hang in the darkness. The fire will breathe in its bed of ash. And in the morning, before the light, someone will wake, and the day will begin again. We have circled the day completely. We have followed its arc from the darkness before dawn, through the light and work and social textures of its hours, back to the darkness of night and quiet of sleep. We have looked at the village from many angles, from the boats on the water, from the waterfront where the fish are processed, from the church, from the hearth, from the perspective of the woman's domestic world, from the perspective of the old and young. We have attended to the economic structure that underlies everything, and to the natural world that surrounds and makes possible the human one. What you are left with, I hope, is not information, or not only information, but something more like texture, the sense of what it felt like to inhabit a particular kind of world, a world smaller in its geographic scope than ours, slower in its rhythms, darker in its nights, and harder than its labor, but not therefore impoverished. A world in which the sea was a daily companion and a daily risk, in which the fire was life, in which the community of 50 households was not a limitation but a totality, the entire human world in its most immediate sense, known completely, related to intimately, understood from the inside. We carry within us, all of us, whatever our origins, the accumulated cellular memory of people who lived like this or something like this for most of the span of human existence. The rhythm of seasons, the knowledge of weather, the social attunement to the small group, the comfort of the fire. These are not things we have merely read about. These are the things that shape the bodies we live in. When you close your eyes in a dark room and you feel the weight of the blanket and the warmth of the edges of your body, you are inhabiting a continuity that extends back further than medieval England, further than any recorded history, to the first people who pulled a covering over themselves and let the darkness hold them and trust the night to end. The village is sleeping. The sea is speaking to the stones in its ancient, patient language. The fire breathes. You can let go of the day now. You can let the rhythm of this place, slow, repetitive, ancient, unhurried, carry you where sleep carries you. There is nothing left to do. The nets are folded. The fish are salted. The blanket fire is banked. The children are warm. Everything that needed to happen today has happened, and the night is long and full and yours. Stay here as long as you need. The village isn't going anywhere. The sea will be there when you wake. The fishermen will go out again in the pre dawn darkness, as they always have, as their fathers did before them, as their children will after them. The nets will be mended, and the fish will be salted, and the fire will be built up from the night's last coals. This is enough. This has always been enough. Sleep well.